Hello tanks and tankettes, and welcome to Patreon Supporter Spotlight number 60, I think this one is. We're kicking this one off with Folly Industries in the 1375, which of course these days gets a far nicer time of it than it used to. One of the many positive changes that's been made to World Tanks over the last, let's say 2 years, was the changes to light tank matchmaking and, of course, the regularization of light tanks with the introduction of the tier 10s. So it means that you can get to be top tier in machines like this, which once upon a time was an incredible rarity. And it means that when you are top tier, you can be a lot more effective than you would be when previously you were having to try and scout in tier 10 games, which was not really the easiest thing. And of course the French scouts, particularly with their not great gun handling, weren't fantastic damage dealers. So as you can see, it is, I want to say Serene Coast. I always get Serene Coast and South Coast mixed up, and I think one of them isn't even in the game anymore, and I can never remember quite which one it is, but never mind. Serene Coast, there we go. I actually looked at the other screen and there it was. So yeah, it's not a terrible map for a mobile tank. In fact, it's quite a good map for a mobile tank, but a lot depends on what the enemy team does or doesn't do in terms of leaving holes in their lines. He's also got a bit of a responsibility of being a top tier tank, but because he's a top tier light tank, it's not like he can go around tanking all the damage. The clip, however, does mean that he can bully some of the lower tier tanks quite effectively, the ones that don't have a lot of armour, and you can just whiz in and do that, and suddenly that's goodbye a tier 5 medium tank. However, the enemy top tier light, the 131, has taken a bit of an interest, so Folly wisely gets out of there because he doesn't have a lot of a backup right now. There's a fair few tanks that went to the small peninsula, and they've also just lost a fair few tanks already. There's already 5 of their team that have died, and they're about to lose a couple more as well. But he's spotted an opportunity with this low health E25 because that is an incredibly dangerous machine, and so the sooner it can be taken out, the better. He does kind of flub his first shot, but it's an auto-loader, so it doesn't matter that much. He's able to then finish it off, and that's quite a dangerous enemy out of the way. He's rapidly running out of support at this point, though, and of course, it being a light tank, as with most light tanks, his only real resource is his hit points. He doesn't particularly have any armour. And that's not universally true. Some of the light tanks do have better armour than others, but the French ones are definitely not in that category in any way, shape or form. And I've sped this bit up because not a lot happens for this kind of minute and a half, 2 minutes, however long this was. He does a bit of dancing around with the 131 and pulls back again, because he's basically got no support beyond artillery at this point. And in a straight up fight, I mean, he could empty his clip in the 131, but it wouldn't be enough to kill him. And at that point, he'd then be sat there taking a bunch of hits whilst his clip was reloading. So it's not really an ideal situation. And he's just having to run around and try and go for the lone enemy tanks, basically. Try and pick off the lone opportune targets, which is starting to become increasingly difficult as the rest of his team is dying at a rate of knots. So there's a bounce on the Churchill, but fortunately his artillery are able to finish the job, and he does get in some shots himself. Also takes a bit more damage in the process, and that WZ is probably his biggest threat at the moment. They've got the mobility to keep up. They've actually got some armour, not so much in the hull, but enough that you know, this gun might struggle a little bit, and the turret particularly can be a little bit trollish for a gun of this nature. But they've taken some damage from, again, I think it's Allied artillery that's really helping them out at this point, and the Lafayette especially has got a pretty nasty rate of fire. So at this point it is just him, artillery, and that E2. Yeah, somebody was pre-aimed there and just reflexively fired without really needing to. The enemy team have a fair few more tanks left alive. They have suffered some casualties, but there's some dangerous machines there. The T-25AT particularly, that gun, you don't want to be on the wrong end of that 105mm. But it's a tank destroyer, so, you know, if he can manoeuvre himself into the right position, he doesn't have to worry about getting shot because, you know, no turret. So that's a bit of a bonus. The 88 also is going to be quite vulnerable to being flanked, so there's opportunities against them. They could potentially be dangerous, but they have weaknesses that Folly can exploit. There's also some tier 5s left, and there's a bit of a weird bug with this replay, specifically with the M4 improved. Can you see the M4 improved on the minimap? I can't. I think he's been spotted at this point. I think Folly, in fact, got spotted by him earlier on when we had the light bulb go off. But for some reason, and I think we're approaching this part of the replay, for some reason the M4 improved just hasn't rendered. And it's really quite peculiar. So there's one of the enemy artillery, in fact, the fastest remaining enemy artillery. I was struggling to, what can I say about the AMX-13? It is a fast artillery, so we'll go with that. Well done, Brain. And there is still one enemy arty left as well, so if he gets that, you know, that could be a medal potentially. But yeah, taking that out especially, that's quite handy. He's just about run out of allies though. It's him and artillery, and they are pushing the base, so he kind of needs to get back at this point, because if nothing else he could use the spotting of his artillery allies, even if they die in the process, to actually get some more damage done, but he's just not in a position to do that, unfortunately. So this is maybe where he could have been trying to help his teammates a bit more. But it's possible that the M4 is around, and in fact the M4 is around. The entirely invisible M4 improved that he's just clipped. I mean, he did take a hit himself, but yeah, it could be that was the factor that was keeping him from going back, that he knew the M4 was at his rear. So yeah, that was a really weird bug. I've not encountered that before, and this is a 1.0 replay rather than a 1.1 replay, or 1.01 or whatever the numbering is at the moment. So it might just be specific to that tank, it might be specific to the replay, but I don't know. That's a very odd one. I've not had that before, where a tank just completely is invisible, doesn't render, doesn't show up on the minimap. So that was like the X factor. There might have been things going on with the positioning of that M4 that was prohibiting him from going back, or I don't know. It's just kind of guesswork, but it was kind of silly. American tank cloaking technology that clearly, you know, hasn't made it into other tanks yet. So he just rushes the T1 heavy. I mean, there wasn't a lot else to try at that point in terms of fancy moves. He could have tried flanking west again, but he would have been spotted doing it. And the T-25AT is not a slow machine exactly, so he just kind of went for it, knowing that his options were becoming slightly limited, and kind of got away with it. He could have survived the hit, certainly, but he'd have preferred not to have taken the damage, and managed not to, fortunately. So he's retreated to the peninsula area and actually picks up the 88. And at this point he has a massive mobility advantage on both of these machines, but he still has to be careful, and he really only truly has an advantage on them in terms of having a turret and an autoloader if he manages to get up close. And that part might be a little trickier. It just depends how it develops. You know, if these two remaining enemy players stick together, that will make life very difficult. And it's not the easiest situation for the enemy players either. They can either try and force the cap, or they can try and defend their own cap at this stage. It's down to that kind of a choice. And they could try and do both, of course, but that then leaves them in a really vulnerable position. That gives away one of their very few remaining advantages that they have. So, time to reposition again. There is a little bit of time to work with, but I mean, if they are all just circling around the map at each other and no one's trying to cap, that's just going to be a draw. And as it is, well, that has to be the T-25AT. So that's really fortuitous timing, given that Folly is coming out behind the cap. And there's a couple of different ways into the cap. Unfortunately, the T-25AT is pointing exactly in his direction. But fortunately, they panic and flub their shot. And so even though that was pretty much the worst possible sight that Folly could have come round the corner to, it ended up being fine. But yeah, that could have been very nasty. That gun could easily one-shot him with the amount of health he has left. It rolls, what, 320 average? So a low roll could have left him alive, but you don't really want to leave it in the hands of RNGs if at all possible. So maybe the slightly more sensible thing to do would have been to take a little bit more of a cautious approach, peek out, see which way the T-25 was actually pointing, but as it was, he got lucky and he got away with it. So there's the 88, he's able to easily circle the rock, come out behind, and if he can get behind the 88, this guy's kind of screwed. And he's placing his shots very carefully at this stage because he has got not a lot of ammunition left. In fact, once this round of APCR is done, he's going to have to do a full reload. Oh, well, that's... was that on purpose? I don't know, you know, if he gets the last kill with the last shell, that's worth the medal, but it's always a bit risky. However, this 88 was a bit screwed either way, so it's possible that that was deliberate, firing off that last round of APCR to reload the last round of AP. As it was, it worked out very, very nicely. That was his ace tanker in the 1375. And really the only moment of just complete luck was the T-25AT just choking so hard. But that was one of those things where it's just a gamble. You know, you come out without really knowing which way someone is pointed, and there's a chance they're looking your way, there's a chance they're looking some other way. And as it was, it did work out in his favour. So 3,000 damage done exactly, 9 kills, and the Orlix medal, I believe that was. Was it the Orlix medal? I think it's the Orlix medal. Or is it Oskins? Oh, I can't remember. It's one of the O ones. He also got the Pascucci's and the Radley Walters there, of course. And overall, that was a pretty nice game. Next, we are on to King Trigon, and this is a 916 replay, so this is going back to the time, the ages ago time, well, really not so long ago, when the Object 268 here was the top of the, or is it the 263? It is the 263, isn't it? Yeah, the Object 263 was the top of well, one of the Soviet tank destroyer lines. It is now a tier 9, and it is not quite the machine it used to be, but I think it still has decent armour frontally. The replacement tier 10 was basically this thing on steroids, and yeah, it's a bit of a problematic machine. It does have a couple of mediocre stats. It has some things about it that aren't that great, but they are quite substantially negated by the things that are quite great. Although I believe they are testing some slight nerfs. I think the weak spot is actually getting more reliable as a weak spot, even though it'll still be quite small. I think they're slightly nerfing some of the gun handling stats. But it doesn't matter that much with the gun handling stats. This is one of the reasons why it's proving to be quite such an overpowered machine, is because you can get in people's faces, and so compared to, say, a 3000 DPM machine which has to sit and snipe at long ranges, and by the way, that poor 50B, that must have been a Death Star Hesh hit, and King Trigon basically picked up the entire spotting, which was quite nice. Anyway, yeah, the difference between 2000 DPM on a machine with a gun that you can afford to just run up and stick in people's faces versus 3000 DPM on a machine that you have to sit and snipe with, and then, you know, let's say you miss a third of the shots, well, it kind of all evens out in the long run, and so you know, the lower DPM matters a little bit less if you basically have guaranteed hits because you're shoving your gun in the front of their tank. Anyway, so I don't really need to talk about the V4 though. There's more than enough about that already. Foch even did a bit of a rant video that was quite a restrained video, all things considered, on it. Let's talk about the game at hand. So far he's managed a decent amount of damage and he's gotten all that spotting on the 50B, but this is looking a bit rough at the moment. The bulk of the enemy team that aren't tank destroyers are here in the town. They also have a bunch of their own tank destroyers that are in a more defensive position, but some of those are going to turn out to have not been very effective players. Trigon obviously himself saw the peril that the IS-4 was in. They were just trying to bum rush him, which was the right thing to do under the circumstances, and so he's been able to get into a position where he can help, and he's actually trying to bodily shield this guy who is currently tracked sideways, or was tracked sideways there in front of all of these medium tanks. So they've managed to blunt the impact of this threat somewhat, but all of the tanks, which is like what, almost half their team that went on the 1, 2, 3 line, have been completely nobbled by, well, you can see there, all of the enemy tank destroyers. The enemy team had quite a lot of tank destroyers, as did their own, as a, you know, proportion of the total team strength. But with the nature of this map, yeah, it's a little bit easier, I would say, from the other spawn in terms of having a group of tank destroyers to actually defend. And so, although they have a couple of non-TDs left, including a scout tank, which might prove to be very, very useful, right now it's a bit of a tricky situation to unpick the remaining enemy tanks who, well, they're probably going to be disinclined to go on the attack. There's every chance, there's a very, very good chance that they will just sit in their own base area and hope that Trigon's team come to them. And the IS-4, who is critically low on health, and the Foch both give it a go, charging down over the open where they can be picked off at leisure. Yes, it's not surprising that that happened even in the slightest. And the Foch particularly, I think they end up doing 0 damage in this game. So yeah, Trigon meanwhile has swung out a bit wider and is moving up to try and help spot with the aid of this WZ-132, and hopefully they can pick up these enemy tank destroyers without getting blown up themselves and use their teammates' firepower. Now this is going to be a bit tricky because this thing has awful gun depression. I don't think that has changed at all, but the superstructure particularly is fairly tough. It's the lower front plate on the V4 that is just so much stronger compared to this, and even then the lower front plate on this was not exactly terrible, but you just needed a reasonably high amount of pen to actually get through it. So he's attracting a fair bit of APCR spam. They're not all firing APCR at him, but a few of them are, which is maybe not surprising. I mean, this is kind of like the part of this game where it's backs against the wall, do or die for both teams. It's just the fact that their team is the one that's having to press in and the enemy team is just completely turtled hard and is hoping to win that way. But as they've moved into position here, as all the enemy tank destroyers seem to have basically gotten themselves into that position over there to try and deal with Trigon and the WZ, that means that their teammates on the other side are now more able to move up without just getting taken apart as they move over open ground. There we go, a very nice shot from the 183 there, just completely evaporates that UDES. He is, however, steadily losing health because they're almost all firing APCR at him, and the 103B's APCR especially, I don't know offhand what pen that's going to have, but like the AP on the Swedish tank destroyers is pretty high pen to begin with. The tier 8 I think almost has like tier 10 levels, or am I particularly thinking of the S1? I bought the S1! I bought the S1 purely to play in the new frontline mode, which it's rather good for, I have to say. But yeah, it's like 288 mil of pen with its standard APCR. It is APCR ammo and that thing, which is one of the reasons why it's so good. The shell velocity is very, very fast. But anyway, but yeah, this has worked out nicely though, and he has gotten a lot more spotting out of it. The WZ presumably has as well. But at this stage, yeah, there's nothing left to do but move in and mop up the last couple of tanks. Although, could have been nasty, but is able to finish off that Foch. And of course, it's the non-auto-loading older variant of the Foch at tier 9. So that was an ace tanker, steel wall, top gun, and a high caliber. Nearly 6,000 damage done, and no, in fact, over 5,000 and nearly 6,000 damage spotted and assisted with, which is still, that's a pretty nice combination, and that put him by far at the head of the team. He must have spotted more than the WZ did, although he did have that bonus nearly 2k spotting from the AMX-50B at the top of the game, which of course meant the 50B had a not very good game, so you have to feel a little bit sorry for that guy. So that's the old Object 263. It's probably a bit less capable these days, but it is a tier 9, so these things they're not going to stay the same and drop down a tier, unfortunately. Actually, why unfortunately? I don't know. Unfortunate if you like the machine, I suppose, but it's logical. You wouldn't just leave something at the same capabilities and move it down a tier. That would make no sense. Anyway, shut up, Bray. So, lastly, we have warships and Andy CX here in Ranked, because the current season of Ranked is upon us. Season whatever this is, I've completely lost track at this point. I even have tried doing a little bit myself. I got as far as playing after about, 2 days of trying. I went from like rank 19 to rank 15. And I might try a little bit more before the season ends, but yeah, generally speaking, my experience with Warship Ranked is I avoid it because I just get a bit too ruffled, if I can put it that way. There are people out there that enjoy the challenge of getting to rank 1, but I'm not one of them, because I tend to just get a bit too annoyed with my teammates, and sometimes annoyed with myself as well, because it's not a game mode where you can afford to make a lot of mistakes. There are fewer players involved, and map control ends up being hugely important. Trying to stick together as a group becomes hugely important, so you can all support each other. Especially in this case, when there are carriers in play, and going off on your own is just making yourself a really attractive target. Now, as far as Andy is concerned, well, he's already in a good ship for dealing with carriers. The North Carolina just has good AA as a baseline. He, however, has spec'd it out even further to be specialised for AA, up to and including having the manual AA captain skill, at which point it has quite murderous levels of AA. So yeah, this enemy carrier is in for a rough old time as far as trying to take their planes basically anywhere near Andy. They might get to make that drop, but as it turns out, no. So that's already 8 kills, that's 2 squads of planes wiped. And he's going to end the game with a lot more than that done, I can tell you. Now, he has to be a little bit careful in terms of his positioning here. The North Carolina isn't particularly forgiving about sailing along broadside, not nearly so much so as, say, a Bismarck or a Tirpitz would be. Or, heck, even the Monarch is fairly, and the Amalgi, in fact, as well. A lot of the Tier 8 battleships, you can kind of get away with it. There's only a kind of a minority where it is truly a bad idea. But it's good practice not to, because even if you can kind of get away with it, sometimes you're going to get spanked really hard regardless. It does, however, have very nice firepower for its tier. These 16-inch guns are extremely reliable, and you couple that with the AA for a situation like this, and it's just all-round a quite nice ship. And being an American battleship, it does handle in the water reasonably nicely as well. So they had a destroyer ahead of them, but they've taken them out, and they're just moving en masse towards this other cap now. And at that point, they will have a superiority of cap points, and therefore they'll have more victory points ticking towards them. And it at that point puts the ball in the enemy team's court. They have to make a move, or else. If they just try and turtle up and swim around, sail around and fire at range, it's probably not going to go that well. For some reason, however, their Hipper has decided to get entirely too close in an effort to try and torpedo that Tirpitz. And that's not something you can really afford to do in a German cruiser. Not at this stage of a game anyway, and especially just doing something so risky towards the start of a ranked game when there's a high risk that you will lose your ship entirely. Yeah, that's not really the smart play. So more planes, more target practice for Andy's gunners. His own carriers fighters are not going to have a lot to do in this one. Yeah, it's not so much. I mean, their own carrier I think is not terrible. Their own Shikaku, I believe it is. But in terms of the AA, like it's Andy. It's absolutely Andy that dominates this one, because just having an AA spec North Carolina in a game where there is a carrier, it's just such a powerful tool. And I don't even know why the enemy carrier tried to bring their planes back in at this point when they could have tried to take them for the Hipper. But even the Hipper is in his AA aura at this point, because it's just, you know, it's what, 7.2 kilometers? It's as good as you can get it at tier 8, I believe. Or is it? No, I think it is. I think there are ships out there you can get up to like 7.5, and the Worcester I think will manage what, like 8.2. So when the Worcester comes along, that will have the best possible AA aura in terms of its spread in the game. But 7.2 is pretty damn respectable. So that was a nice paddling on that Prince Eugen, which of course does have a heal, so that's not going to be quite as devastating as it would have been once upon a time. But I still think the Eugen's not the best ship to take into rank, and the fact that Wargaming decided to offer some missions specifically for the Eugen in ranked games that's just encouraging people to take a mediocre ship in, quite frankly. And it's not a terrible ship, but in terms of damage dealing, there are better. I really, at this point, yeah, we need a pre-recorded dirty Jingles laugh for that, and maybe a little snippet of him saying, "That's a paddlin," because Richelieu, what were you thinking? Why would you pull out broadside in front of a North Carolina's 16-inch guns? Just why would you pull out broadside in front of any battleship's guns at this range? That was just suicidal, quite frankly, and they're sort of lucky they didn't die outright, but there's no way they're walking away from this alive. And there we go, finishes him off with another Citadel. So it's looking alright so far. They've taken out both enemy battleships. The enemy carrier doesn't have a lot that they can do to Andy specifically. They have 2/3 of the cap points, although the enemy's destroyers are contesting the A cap, but they've got their own destroyers and the Tirpitz there in action, and so it should be fine, right? That just leaves Andy free to concentrate on doing something about this Prince Eugen. And of course their own carrier is oh wait, no, their own carrier's dead at this point. Well, never mind, that's not so good, especially in terms of spotting the enemy destroyers. But yes, you might have noted that the enemy destroyers, after capping C, basically made just a beeline for their Shikaku. They went to the edge of the map and went for the Shikaku, and it kind of worked out. There wasn't a lot their own team could reliably do about it at that point to try and save the Shikaku. But tactically speaking, from their point of view, for both, or for 2 of the 3 enemy destroyers to do that was not a good use of their resources as a team. So it kind of sucked for the carrier, but it was also really not very good play from those destroyers. So 4 versus 3, yet more planes being fed to Andy, which is nice. But well, they've just lost the Tirpitz, and it was actually the Kagero that had died, so they got a flesh wound award. So that's not so good, but Andy's still in play. He's still got a decent amount of health, and the the destroyer that's left, the Benson, doesn't have especially fast torpedoes. So although Andy is in reasonably good shape, he's got also allies to spot for him, right? Suddenly that's a problem. We've gone from 4 versus 3, was it, to 1 versus 3. Okay, this is not looking so good. The Benson is the biggest threat right now, absolutely, but they're also the hardest threat to actually counter at this stage, because all he has is his spotter plane. And although his AA is good, I'm pretty sure the enemy carrier is making efforts to take out his spotter plane when he launches them. Although, if he keeps hanging his planes around in the AA bubble of North Carolina, that hopefully that issue will take care of itself. So he's keeping his guns pointed in the direction where he knows there is a destroyer. He's varying his course a bit. He really can't do much else at this point. And, well, it did give the Eugen a bit of free rein to just spam him with some HE. But fortunately for Andy, it's German HE. So it's not like he's getting spammed with HE from, say, a Chapayev or something, or a Kutuzov, or hell, even one of the other, like a New Orleans, or the whatever the French tier 8 is, the Charles Martel, maybe? Anyway, basically everything but the Eugen or a Hipper would have been a bit more dangerous in terms of that. But he's still taking some damage. So he decides to do something about it, try and take out the Eugen, and the Eugen's also trying to close to torpedo distance, although they're just at the edge of range. Unfortunately, his second salvo on the Eugen is much less successful, because, battleships are fun, you guys. They can be a heck of a lot of fun. And this replay is going to maybe show some of why they are fun. They have a survivability that other classes just don't. But it's not like the Eugen is especially playing smart there, it's just they got really lucky. So that third salvo does the job that the second really should have. The Benson's torps do seem to be out of sequence, so that's a bit easier for Andy in terms of not having to worry about an undodgeable wall of torps. He's also, despite the at one point double fire, very assiduously keeping his repair party available in case he gets a flooding, because of course that would be the really fatal thing. So there we go, another 2 plane kills is enough there for the Air Defense Expert, which is the thing that is one of the replacements for the Clear Skies medal. There's actually now 2 separate medals. There's one for carriers and there's one for everybody else. And it does seem like this enemy carrier is pretty much out of torpedo bombers at this point, so it's down to just the dive bombers and, of course, the Benson. And the disadvantage for Andy is the carrier can spot for the Benson, but there's nobody to spot for Andy. And this is the part where having their own carrier left alive might have been really very handy, just to have somebody that could spot a destroyer. So he's got HE loaded on the basis that it will do theoretically more damage and certainly more module damage to a destroyer. But what shows up next is in fact the enemy carrier, who is trying to go for the cap. And, kudos, they're trying to do something useful, but at the moment they are ahead on points, just because they had the 2 cap circles and they've managed to largely keep ahead for most of the game on kills. And so that's been enough, basically. But, well, it's not like the game is in imminent, it's not like it's about to finish. So, he really just has to stay alive and hope that even though they're only getting the points from 1 cap circle at the moment, that's enough to carry them to 1,000 points before the enemy team gets to 1,000. Now at this stage, it's debatable. I mean, we're towards the end of this replay, but it's debatable whether he should have switched back to AP, because the AP still would have done damage against the Benson. And if he didn't have shots at the Benson, which he's about to not to because the Benson's just smoked, then he could switch to the Enterprise, and it would be a tasty amount of damage, if nothing else. And heck, they might even be able to do enough damage at this range against the broadside Enterprise to just completely finish them off entirely, which would certainly push them easily over 1,000 points. But as it is, he's just stuck with HE, and the Benson just has popped back into view, but I think he's slightly flubbing his shots here. He's not giving quite enough lead, but it's understandable that he might be feeling the pressure slightly, because he's been the only one alive for, what, like half of this game? And he's basically carried this entire match. So, Yeah, he could have walked away from that with a much higher damage score and maybe ended it slightly quicker with use of AP at the end there, but you can see why he used the HE, so it's not a totally illogical decision. So nearly 130k damage, a nice clutch of medals, over 3,000 base XP, 70 plane kills. That enemy Enterprise had to be getting close to being totally deplaned. In fact, they might have been almost deplaned because he wasn't the only one getting plane kills in that. It's just he got the most. So, yeah, that could have been a slightly better result, but as it was still a bloody good result. And I think I am right in remembering that that's his best XP game ever. And it does help that it's slightly smaller sizes of games, because the XP is a bit more concentrated in terms of the smaller player numbers. Or at least I assume it is. I assume it works that way. But yeah, the 70 plane kills certainly would have done a lot to contribute to that over 3,000 base XP. But even so, you know, the nearly 130k damage, that's no slouch either. The fact that he got the high caliber out of that is certainly no surprise. There were some other decent players on his team, but at the end, that enemy Benson kind of gave it away. I don't know, they were doing weird things with the smoke, the fact that they were making the split drops and not trying to... I don't know, I mean, it wasn't the best situation in the world for that Benson, but still, they kind of messed it up. I feel like maybe they could have been a bit more effective there, and instead, despite the disadvantages, Andy managed to come through. So that's all for this particular set of replays. I will note at this stage that I have a couple of empty spaces at the moment on Patreon. I don't pimp myself or my Patreon page that often. I should have just said pimp my Patreon page, because if I'm talking about pimping myself, that maybe has a whole different set of connotations, but never mind. Yeah, anyway, there's a couple of open spaces at the moment, and so if you feel like supporting me, even if it's not for the top amount, even if it's only just like, you know, $1 a month, that still helps me out. It's still a huge benefit, because YouTube ad revenue, not so reliable anymore, and hasn't been for quite a long time. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed these replays, and if you did, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.